The sun had barely risen, casting a pale orange glow over the city streets as Daniel sat hunched on the curb. His clothes, ragged and worn, blended into the cracked sidewalk. A cardboard sign rested on his lap, its faded letters reading, "Will work for food. Anything helps." The world around him rushed by. People in suits, hurried businessmen, parents walking their children to school, but none of them took notice. He had grown used to the silence of invisibility. Daniel hadn't always been like this. There was a time when he had a family, a job, and a purpose. But life had a cruel way of shoving him to the edge, a series of unfortunate events that led to the cold streets where he now sat. A war veteran, he'd fought for his country, but it felt like he had lost the fight for his own life. Today was just another day. Another morning of asking for change and hoping for a kind soul to stop, to acknowledge his existence. He didn't expect much. People walked past, their eyes glazed over, their wallets tight. But then, something caught his eye. A sleek black limousine pulling up to the curb. It wasn't unusual to see luxury cars in this part of town, but this one was different. It stopped right in front of him. The door of the limo swung open, and for a split second, Daniel thought maybe someone had dropped something and would come over to hand it to him. But then, a tall figure stepped out. The man was dressed in a sharp suit, the kind that screamed wealth and power. Daniel squinted, trying to make sense of the sight before him. Donald Trump. The name echoed in his mind. The real estate mogul, the former president. He had seen the man on TV, heard stories of his wealth and influence. But seeing him here, right in front of him, was surreal. Trump glanced down at Daniel, his eyes narrowing for a moment, as if trying to assess the situation. Without a word, he walked up to the homeless man, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Hey," Trump said, his voice carrying an unexpected warmth. "You need some help?" Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Was this a joke? Was this really happening? In all his years on the streets, he had never imagined being approached by someone like him. Daniel stammered, his mind racing. "I was just asking for $1. Trump looked at him, then to the sign in his lap, and nodded slowly. He paused for a moment, as if contemplating something important. "Here's the thing," Trump said, pulling out his wallet. "I can give you $1, sure, but I want to hear your story. How did you end up here?" Daniel was stunned. A part of him expected Trump to dismiss him with a sneer or a passing comment, something condescending. Instead, the question hung in the air, genuine curiosity in the billionaire's voice. "Why do you care?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Trump leaned in slightly, his eyes never leaving Daniel's. "Because sometimes the smallest moment can change everything," he replied. "So, tell me, what's your story?" Daniel's mind went blank. He had told his story 100 times, of how he lost his job, his wife, and eventually his dignity. But telling it to him felt different. Daniel didn't know where to start. A moment of silence passed before Trump took a seat beside him on the curb, never breaking eye contact. "Don't worry. I'm not here to judge. Just tell me what happened." The limo's engine hummed quietly in the background, the hustle of the city continuing around them. Yet for Daniel, the world seemed to slow down. He didn't know why, but he felt like he could trust this man. Maybe it was the sincerity in his eyes, or maybe it was the fact that for the first time in a long time, someone was actually listening. As Daniel began to speak, Trump nodded, his expression thoughtful. Daniel didn't know it yet, but this moment, this conversation, would mark the beginning of something that would change both their lives forever. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Daniel sat there, his hands trembling slightly as he began to speak. For the first time in what felt like years, someone was actually paying attention to him. He glanced at the man beside him, the same man who was the face of billions, whose name was known worldwide, and for a moment, it felt like they were just two people having an ordinary conversation. That alone seemed like a miracle. He cleared his throat, the words coming slowly at first. "I used to have everything. A job I loved, a wife who meant the world to me, a house. Life was good. I wasn't rich, but I had enough. I thought I was living the American dream." Trump listened intently, nodding as Daniel spoke, his eyes never leaving Daniel's face. There wasn't a hint of judgment in his gaze, only a quiet understanding. It all started to unravel after I came back from overseas. I was in the army, a sergeant. We were stationed in Afghanistan. I came back changed. The nightmares, the stress, it took a toll on me. At first, I thought it would pass, but it didn't. I lost my job because I couldn't focus. My marriage ended because she couldn't handle the person I'd become. I wasn't the man she married anymore. Daniel paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. He looked down at his hands, his mind replaying the memories that were too painful to face. Eventually, I lost everything. My house, my dignity, my sense of purpose. And here I am, sitting on the streets asking for change, hoping that maybe someone will care. The words felt like a weight lifting off his chest. It wasn't often he opened up about his past, and even less so to someone like Trump. But there was something about this moment, something raw and honest, that made it easy to let his guard down. Trump didn't interrupt, just let him talk. When Daniel finished, he leaned back, folding his arms, his expression unreadable for a moment. You know, I've heard a lot of stories like yours, Trump said quietly. People who hit rock bottom and don't know where to go. But here's the thing, Daniel. You're still here. You didn't give up. Daniel couldn't help but scoff. Yeah, but what does that matter? I'm still here, but I'm nobody. Just a man on the street begging for help. Trump turned to face him fully, his voice firm but not unkind. You're wrong. You're somebody. And that's why you're still here. Because even when everything falls apart, there's something inside you that refuses to quit. That's the difference between those who give up and those who fight. And I see that in you. For a moment, Daniel didn't know how to respond. It was strange, hearing these words from a man who had everything, from someone who had the world at his fingertips. But there was something in his tone, something real, that made Daniel reconsider his perspective. Trump leaned forward slightly. I don't know what you're going through, but I know that everyone has a choice. You can either sit here and let the world pass you by, or you can take that first step towards something different. I don't know if you'll succeed, but I do know this. You have it in you to try. The words hung in the air, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt a spark of something. Hope? Determination? He wasn't sure, but it was there, flickering in the back of his mind. Why are you helping me? Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Trump smiled, a small, knowing smile. Maybe it's because I've seen the way people can change when they have someone who believes in them. Maybe it's because I've been where you are, too, in my own way. Daniel looked at him, his brow furrowing in confusion. You? But you're Donald Trump. You've never been where I am. Trump chuckled softly, shaking his head. You'd be surprised. Everyone goes through tough times, Daniel. Some people just hide it better than others. But the truth is, we all face challenges. The difference is how we deal with them. The conversation paused as the sound of the busy street continued around them. People bustled about, cars honked, and life carried on as if nothing had changed. But for Daniel, something was shifting. The man sitting beside him wasn't just a celebrity or a billionaire. He was a reminder that no matter how far down a person might fall, there was always a way back up. There was always a choice. You don't have to give me money, Daniel said, almost out of habit. I just wanted to know if anyone cared, you know? Trump looked at him for a moment, his expression softening. I think that's what people forget. It's not about the money. It's about feeling like you matter. And Daniel, you matter. Maybe not to the whole world right now, but you matter to me. The words hit Daniel harder than he expected. It was as though a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He didn't know if he could ever be the man he once was, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a chance to start again. As Trump stood up to leave, he turned to Daniel one last time. I don't know where your journey goes from here, but I want you to remember something. It's not where you start that counts, it's where you end up. And if you're willing to try, I believe you can end up somewhere great. And with that, he got back into his limousine, leaving Daniel alone on the curb once more. But this time, it didn't feel quite as lonely. Daniel watched as Trump's limousine disappeared down the street, the hum of the engine fading into the background noise of the city. For a long moment, he He sat there in silence, processing everything that had just happened. The conversation felt surreal. It was as if he had been pulled out of his own life for a few minutes and placed into a different reality. A reality where someone like Trump, took the time to listen, to care. The world around him seemed to spin in slow motion. The sound of footsteps, the distant chatter of pedestrians, the honking cars, all of it felt distant, muffled, as if it didn't matter. What mattered was the conversation, the feeling of being seen and heard for the first time in a long while. For the rest of the day, Daniel didn't ask for money. He didn't hold up his sign or beg for change. Instead, he sat on the curb, lost in thought. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its warm glow on the streets, but all Daniel could think about were Trump's words. You matter. You have it in you to try. You can end up somewhere great. It sounded so simple, yet so impossible. How could a man like him, a broken, homeless vet with nothing left, ever end up somewhere great? His mind kept circling back to that question, as if trying to solve some impossible puzzle. That night, he lay in his usual spot under the bridge, the cold creeping in despite the heat of the day. The sounds of the city were muffled, but the thoughts in his head were loud, louder than ever before. He couldn't stop thinking about what Trump had said. Could he really change? Could he take a step out of the gutter and into something better? The next morning, Daniel woke up early, before the sun had fully risen. The cold was still there, biting at his bones, but the thought of something different, something better, stirred inside him. Maybe it was just a spark, maybe just a fleeting thought, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't go back to the way things were. With shaking hands, he pulled on the worn jacket that barely fit, his shoes a size too small. He had no idea what he was doing or where he was going, but the only thing that mattered right now was moving. He walked through the streets of the city, passing familiar faces that ignored him, people who had no idea what was going on inside him. But for the first time, it didn't matter. He found himself outside a small cafe, its windows fogged up from the warmth inside. He hesitated for a moment, the cold air stinging his skin, before pushing open the door. The bell above the door jingled, and the warmth hit him like a wave. The barista behind the counter looked up, offering a smile that was both professional and kind. "Can I help you?" she asked. Daniel opened his mouth, but for a moment, the words wouldn't come. He had been on the streets so long, used to being invisible, that speaking up felt foreign. But then, he remembered Trump's words. You matter. And for once, Daniel believed it. I'd like a coffee, he said, his voice hoarse. A black coffee. The barista raised an eyebrow, but she didn't say anything. She simply nodded and made the coffee. As she handed it to him, Daniel fumbled for his change, but the woman stopped him. Don't worry about it. It's on the house, she said, her smile warm and genuine. Daniel stood there for a moment, stunned. He didn't know how to react. He had been rejected so many times that kindness like this felt almost foreign. But as he took the coffee, he felt a surge of gratitude. Thank you, he said quietly, the words coming easier now. The barista smiled again, and as he turned to leave, she added, Good luck. I hope you find what you're looking for. Daniel stepped out of the cafe, the hot coffee warming his hands. For the first time in years, he felt like he might actually be on the verge of something. It wasn't much, just a cup of coffee, a few kind words, but it was a start. It was a reminder that he was still here, still fighting, still worthy of kindness. And that meant everything. Daniel's walk through the city continued as he reflected on his conversation with Trump. He couldn't help but think of the billionaire's story, the struggles Trump had mentioned, the challenges that were part of his own journey. In a strange way, it made Daniel feel less alone, less isolated in his own fight. As the days passed, he started doing small things differently. He took the time to clean himself up a little more each morning, even if it was just wiping his face with a damp cloth. He made an effort to talk to people, to engage in brief conversations instead of hiding in the shadows. It wasn't easy. People still looked past him, still ignored him more often than not. But there were moments, small moments, when someone would acknowledge him, a smile, a nod, a simple hello. He had learned to take those moments and hold on to them, like lifelines in the vast sea of indifference that often surrounded him. He wasn't ready to change everything overnight, but he was ready to try. And that was enough for now. The days drifted by, and though nothing miraculous happened, Daniel began to feel a shift within himself. He wasn't waiting for his life to be transformed overnight. No, that wasn't realistic. But he had taken that first step. He had listened, opened up, and allowed himself to consider the possibility of change. Each morning, as he walked through the city streets, he felt the weight of the past lifting just a little. He wasn't sure where this would lead, but he was no longer consumed by the fear of being stuck forever. That feeling, the one that had paralyzed him for so long, was fading, and it was being replaced with something else. Hope. It was fragile, like a flame in a storm, but it was there. Daniel had learned a lot from the small interactions in the past few days. He started noticing things he had once ignored, the kindness of strangers, the fleeting moments of connection. It was easy to get caught up in the struggle for survival on the streets, but life had a way of showing up in unexpected places. One afternoon, as he walked through a neighborhood park, he saw a man sitting on a bench, reading a newspaper. The man was well-dressed, with a briefcase beside him, and he appeared to be completely absorbed in his reading. Daniel hesitated before approaching. Something about the man's calm demeanor reminded him of the person he used to be, a man with a purpose, a man who knew where he was going. He walked over slowly, his heart racing. He wasn't sure why, but something told him he had to speak to this man. Maybe it was the simple fact that he had been invisible for so long, and for once, he wanted to be seen. "Excuse me, sir," Daniel said, his voice tentative. The man didn't look up, so Daniel repeated himself. "Excuse me, sir. Can I ask you something?" Finally, the man lowered the newspaper, his eyes meeting Daniel's with mild curiosity. "Yes," he said, his voice neutral, but not unkind. I don't mean to bother you. I was just wondering. I've been trying to get back on my feet. Do you have any advice? Anything that might help me get started again?" Daniel's words tumbled out quickly, his throat tight with vulnerability. It wasn't easy to ask for help, especially from someone who seemed to have everything together. The man studied him for a moment, his gaze steady. Daniel couldn't read him. Was he judging him? Feeling pity? Or was he simply wondering why a man in his situation would ask for advice? After a long pause, the man put down the newspaper and folded his hands in his lap. "You've already taken the hardest step, you know," he said slowly. "Asking for help. That's the first hurdle most people never get over. They think they have to do everything on their own, that asking for help means failure. But that's not true." Daniel blinked, caught off guard by the man's response. It wasn't what he expected, but there was something about it that felt reassuring. "You've got to keep moving forward," the man continued, his voice calm but firm. "Even when you don't feel like it, even when it's hard. There will be days when it seems impossible, but you can't give up. Keep moving, one step at a time." The simplicity of the advice hit Daniel harder than he anticipated. He had heard it all before. Don't give up, keep going, stay positive. But there was something in this man's tone that made it feel real. He wasn't just offering empty words. He was offering something practical, something that Daniel could hold on to. "And remember," the man added, "there's no shame in starting small. You don't have to change everything all at once. It's the little things that build up over time. Take it day by day." For the first time in ages, Daniel felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. It was a small thing, this conversation, but it felt monumental. This wasn't just advice, it was a lifeline. Someone had given him a glimpse of a way forward, and it wasn't as complicated as he'd imagined. It wasn't about huge, dramatic changes. It was about making small decisions, one after another, each one building on the last. "Thank you," Daniel said quietly, the words feeling thick in his throat. The man gave him a kind smile. "Good luck. Keep going." Daniel nodded and walked away, the words echoing in his mind as he made his way back through the park. It wasn't the first time someone had given him advice, but there was something different about this encounter. The man had seen him, heard him, and given him something to hold on to. And that meant the world. Over the next few weeks, Daniel took small steps each day. He kept walking, kept asking questions, kept talking to people. He started to clean himself up in the mornings, finding places to freshen up when he could. He didn't have much, a few belongings stashed in a backpack, a few dollars to his name, but he started to feel a little more human again, a little less invisible. It wasn't easy. There were days when he felt like giving up, when he wanted to crawl back into his shell and pretend the world didn't exist. But he reminded himself of the advice he had received. Keep going, one step at a time. And then one day, a man approached him. A man with a similar story, someone who had been down on his luck but had managed to climb back up. This man offered him something more than just words. He offered Daniel a job. It was a small job, nothing fancy, just a part-time gig doing some maintenance work for a local business. But it was something. It was a chance. And that was enough for Daniel. Daniel had never imagined a moment like this. It was a small job, sure, but it felt monumental. The weight of the opportunity wasn't lost on him. It was as though everything he had been working toward had led him to this one moment, this first real step back into a life he had nearly forgotten. The man who had offered him the job, Greg, was someone Daniel didn't expect to meet. He wasn't rich or powerful, just an ordinary guy who had experienced the same kind of struggle Daniel was going through. But there was something different about Greg, a certain determination, a quiet strength that made Daniel feel like maybe, just maybe, he could learn something from him. Greg was kind, patient, and had no problem explaining things to Daniel. His job was simple. He needed help maintaining a small storefront and doing odd jobs like cleaning and organizing. But for Daniel, it was more than just the work. It was the first time in years he felt needed. It wasn't much, but it was real. And that made all the difference. The first day on the job felt surreal. Daniel woke up early, nervous but excited. He had spent so long just surviving, existing day by day, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have a purpose. But now, here he was, showing up on time, ready to work. As he walked into the store, Greg greeted him with a smile. "Good to see you, Daniel," he said, his tone easygoing but sincere. "Let's get started." The work was menial, sweeping floors, organizing shelves, and moving boxes. Nothing that would change the world, but it didn't need to. Daniel felt a sense of pride as he worked, seeing the results of his effort. The store slowly started to look better, cleaner. There was something about the simplicity of the task that helped clear his mind. At first, he found it hard to keep up. His hands weren't as steady as they used to be, and the physical labor took more out of him than he expected. But as the hours passed, Daniel felt a sense of accomplishment that he hadn't felt in years. It was like a small victory, one that he could hold on to. Greg checked in on him periodically, offering encouragement when needed. "You're doing great," he said during lunch. "I know it's a lot of work, but you're getting it done. Keep it up." And for the first time in a long while, Daniel believed it. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was a beginning. It was a chance to prove to himself that he was capable, that he had value. As the days turned into weeks, Daniel settled into the routine. Every morning, he would wake up early, wash up, and head to the store. He had learned to take pride in the work, even if it was humble. And each day, Greg continued to offer words of encouragement, as though he knew exactly what Daniel needed to hear. One day, after a long shift, Greg pulled Daniel aside. "You're doing well, Daniel. I think you're ready for something more," he said, his voice calm but serious. Daniel's heart raced. He didn't expect a promotion or anything like that. "What do you mean?" he asked, unsure if he'd heard Greg right. "I mean, you've shown up, you've put in the work, and you've got the attitude. I think you're ready to take on a little more responsibility around here," Greg explained. "I need someone I can trust, and I think you're that guy." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. The offer wasn't life-changing, but it was everything. It was validation. It was proof that he could rebuild, one step at a time. It wasn't just about the job. It was about everything he had fought for. The chance to change, the opportunity to show the world, and himself, that he wasn't lost forever. "I'll do my best, Greg," Daniel said, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you." That night, as Daniel lay in his small bed under the bridge, the weight of the day settled over him. He thought back to that moment when Trump had given him the simple advice, "You matter." It had seemed like just words at the time. But now, with each passing day, those words felt like a lifeline. They had pulled him from the depths of despair and into the light of possibility. He wasn't there yet. The journey was far from over. But the first step had been taken, and that was enough. It was a beginning, and he wasn't alone anymore. Daniel closed his eyes, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, and that was all he needed. The next few weeks brought both triumphs and struggles for Daniel. He wasn't sure what was harder, the work or the mental battle. The physical labor wasn't a shock to him. He had spent enough time on the streets that his body had gotten used to hard, exhausting work. But the real challenge was in his mind. There were days when he felt like an imposter, like he didn't belong in this new world he was trying to enter. Each time he walked into the store, he had to push aside that voice in his head that told him he wasn't good enough, that he was just pretending to be something he wasn't. But with every shift, he proved that voice wrong. He wasn't pretending. He was becoming something new. It wasn't just the work that was changing him. It was the people around him. The regular customers at the shop started to notice him. At first, they'd been dismissive or barely acknowledged his presence. But now, they greeted him with a nod or a smile. Some even began to ask him how his day was going, offering small words of encouragement. Daniel had never realized how much a simple, kind word could mean. It was like a spark that ignited something inside him, a belief that he was part of something again, that he was seen. One of the hardest things Daniel faced was his own insecurities. Every night, as he lay down on his thin mattress under the bridge, the old doubts crept in. He thought about how far he still had to go, how little he had in terms of savings, how his clothes still didn't fit right, how there was still so much to fix in his life. But even as these thoughts swirled, something new started to take root in him: determination. It was a slow burn at first, but Daniel began to feel a shift. His mornings felt less like a chore and more like an opportunity. He found himself cleaning up a little more, trying to be present in every small moment, taking pride in the work he was doing. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he was building something from the ground up. He was moving forward, step by step, no matter how small the steps were. One morning, as Daniel was walking to work, he ran into an old friend. Well, not exactly a friend, but someone he used to know. His name was Peter, and they had spent some time on the streets together a few years ago. Back then, Peter had been one of the guys who would get drunk and tell stories about the good old days. But now, seeing him again, Daniel noticed something different. Peter looked worn, just like Daniel had once felt, tired and beaten down by life. His clothes were ragged, and his face was streaked with dirt. "Hey, Daniel," Peter called out, his voice rough. "You look good, man. What's going on?" Daniel felt a pang of guilt. He wasn't sure why, but seeing Peter like this made him feel uncomfortable. He had changed so much in the last few weeks, but Peter still seemed stuck, like he hadn't found a way out. "I'm doing all right," Daniel replied, offering a small smile. "Got a job, actually, working at a store downtown. Things are looking up." Peter's eyes narrowed for a second, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "A job? You? Man, that's great. I can't believe it." His voice was a mix of disbelief and envy. "Yeah, it's a good start," Daniel said, not sure how to react. He wasn't used to hearing someone talk to him like that, but there was a small part of him that felt proud of what he had accomplished. "You doing okay, Peter?" Peter shook his head. "Nah, man. You know how it is. I can't seem to get things together. The streets just keep pulling me back. I don't know how to get out of this hole." Daniel hesitated. He wanted to help, to give Peter the same advice that had helped him, but he wasn't sure if it would make a difference. Peter wasn't ready. "Not yet." "Peter, listen. It doesn't have to stay this way," Daniel said, his voice steady. "You can make a change. I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm proof that it's possible. You just have to take that first step." Peter looked at him with a mix of skepticism and longing. "I don't know, man. Maybe you're right. Maybe I need to try something different." Daniel patted him on the shoulder. "Take it one step at a time. That's all you need to do." Peter nodded slowly, but there was doubt in his eyes. Still, Daniel hoped that somewhere, deep down, those words would stick with him. He had come so far in such a short time, but he knew the journey wasn't over. And he knew that Peter's path, like his, would take time. That night, As Daniel returned to his usual spot under the bridge, he thought about his encounter with Peter. The feeling of helplessness he had seen in Peter's eyes was all too familiar. It was the same feeling Daniel had carried for so long. The belief that change wasn't possible, that nothing could ever be different. But now, he knew better. Change wasn't instant, and it wasn't easy. But it was possible, one small step at a time. As he lay in his bed, the weight of the day settled over him. There were still challenges ahead. There were still moments when the old doubts tried to creep in. But tonight, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years: pride. He wasn't where he wanted to be yet, but he was moving forward. And that was enough. Daniel wasn't used to being the one who offered help. For most of his life, he had been on the receiving end, taking whatever small assistance people were willing to give. Whether it was a kind word from a stranger or a few spare dollars, Daniel had always been the one reaching out for support, hoping someone would throw him a lifeline. But something had shifted in him over the past few weeks. As he worked alongside Greg and the other employees, he had started to see the value in giving back. It wasn't about grand gestures or charity. It was about small moments of kindness, about offering a hand when someone else needed it. The more Daniel worked, the more he realized how much he had to offer. It wasn't just about labor. It was about being there for others, just as they had been there for him. He'd learned to listen, to be present in a way he hadn't before. And he was beginning to see how powerful that could be. It was during a lunch break that Greg noticed something in Daniel. They had just finished unloading a new shipment of supplies when Greg casually asked, "Hey, you have a minute?" "Of course," Daniel replied, wiping his hands on his apron. "What's up?" Greg leaned against the counter, looking thoughtful. "I've been thinking about something. I know you've been through a lot, and I can see the progress you've made. But I also know you're still facing some tough times, outside of work." Daniel nodded, unsure where this conversation was going. "I'm not asking you to fix everything, Daniel," Greg continued, "but I think you're ready to take on something more. I've been thinking about helping out a few of the other guys around here who are going through some struggles, guys who've fallen on hard times, just like you did." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I'm talking about mentoring them, giving them a hand, showing them that things can get better. I think you've got the experience to help someone else." The idea startled Daniel. He wasn't sure he was ready to be someone's mentor. He still had so much to figure out for himself, but Greg's words stuck with him. Maybe helping someone else wasn't about having all the answers. Maybe it was about showing up, being there, and letting someone know that they weren't alone. Later that week, Daniel found himself talking to Marcus, one of the other workers at the store. Marcus was younger than Daniel, maybe in his early 20s, and he had a tough exterior, but Daniel could tell there was more to him. Like Daniel, Marcus had a past that wasn't easy to talk about, and they both understood what it was like to feel like the world had left them behind. "So, what's going on with you, Marcus?" Daniel asked as they took a break together. "You've been kind of quiet lately." Marcus glanced at him, his eyes wary. "I don't know. Just been thinking about stuff. Been stuck, you know?" Daniel nodded. He understood more than Marcus probably realized. "Yeah, I get it. I was stuck too, not that long ago. It's tough, but I'm telling you, things can change. It doesn't happen overnight, but one day, you'll wake up and realize that you've moved forward." Marcus looked at him with a skeptical expression. "I don't know if I believe that, man. My situation's different." "It's not," Daniel said gently. "I've been where you are. But I'm telling you, every little step counts. It's about just doing one thing today that gets you closer to where you want to be. That's all." For a moment, there was silence between them. Marcus didn't speak, but his eyes seemed to soften, and Daniel thought maybe, just maybe, he was starting to understand. The next few days, Daniel took it upon himself to check in on Marcus more often. He didn't have any great wisdom to offer, but he knew what it was like to feel lost, to feel like no one cared. So he made an effort to show Marcus that someone did care. They started having more conversations, sharing small bits of advice. Nothing huge, but enough to make a difference. Daniel's role in Marcus' life was still small, but it felt meaningful. He wasn't giving Marcus answers or taking away his struggles, but he was showing him that there was a way out, that change was possible. Daniel was starting to realize that helping someone else didn't require having it all together. It just required showing up. Later that week, Daniel received a surprising message. It was from Peter, the man he had run into on the street a few weeks ago. The message was short, but it was clear. I'm ready to try. Can we talk? Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected Peter to reach out, especially after their last conversation. But it felt like a sign, like maybe things were starting to come full circle. The next morning, Daniel met Peter at a small coffee shop in town. Peter looked rough, but there was something different in his eyes, a glimmer of hope that hadn't been there before. I've been thinking about what you said, Peter started, looking down at his coffee. I've been stuck for so long, man, but I don't want to stay this way. I want to change. Daniel smiled, a mixture of pride and relief filling him. It's not easy, Peter, but you don't have to do it alone. I've got your back. Peter nodded slowly. I don't even know where to start. That's okay, Daniel said. Start with one step. That's all you need. The rest will follow. As Daniel sat there, talking with Peter, he realized something important. The journey he was on wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the people he could help along the way. He wasn't just changing his life. He was helping others change theirs. And in doing so, he was finding a new sense of purpose, one that he could never have imagined when he was on the streets. It wasn't easy. There were still setbacks, still days when Daniel doubted himself. But each day, he kept going. He kept showing up, both for himself and for the people around him. And slowly, it was starting to make a difference. It had been nearly 2 months since Daniel started his new life. And though he still faced plenty of struggles, he was no longer the same man who had once begged for $1. The changes were subtle but real. His clothes were a little more fitting, his hair was trimmed neatly, and his steps had more purpose. Each day, he woke up with a goal in mind, knowing that there were people counting on him. He was finally starting to see what it meant to live with dignity again. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving. But with success came new challenges. Daniel soon realized that he could never completely escape his past, no matter how hard he tried. One evening, as he left work and walked down the familiar streets to his spot under the bridge, he had an encounter that reminded him of how fragile his new life still was. As Daniel rounded the corner near his old stomping grounds, he saw a familiar face standing on the street corner. It was Marcus, the young man from work, but something was off. He wasn't walking to the store for his shift like usual. Instead, he stood at the edge of the sidewalk, staring down at the ground. Hey, Marcus, you all right? Daniel called out, his voice carrying through the chilly air. Marcus looked up, his face tense, his eyes bloodshot. It wasn't the usual expression of the energetic, if a bit troubled young man that Daniel had come to know. This was different, darker. I'm not sure, Marcus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. I messed up. I don't know what to do. Daniel approached him, his heart sinking at the sight of his colleague's broken spirit. He had seen the signs before, in people who had fallen back into old habits. What happened, man? I lost it all, Marcus muttered. I slipped up. I went out with some friends last night, and I ended up drinking. I was supposed to meet with you today, but I couldn't make it. I don't even know why I did it. I was doing so good, Daniel. Why did I let it all slip away? Daniel could see the pain in Marcus's face, the regret, the disappointment. He knew this feeling all too well. The battle between wanting to stay on track and the pull of old habits, of the familiar comfort that alcohol or bad choices gave. It wasn't an easy fight, and Daniel didn't have all the answers. But he also knew that Marcus wasn't alone. Hey, listen, Daniel said, stepping closer and placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. You're not the first person to fall down. The important part is getting back up. Marcus looked up at him, his eyes filled with uncertainty. But what if I can't? What if I'm just stuck like I always have been? Daniel paused, searching for the right words. He had been in the same place, not knowing if he could climb out, feeling trapped in a cycle that never seemed to end. But then he remembered something that Greg had told him during one of their talks. You don't have to do it all at once, Marcus. Just take one step forward. That's it. Start with today. If you mess up tomorrow, you get up and start again. It's not about perfection, it's about persistence. Marcus's eyes softened. But I'm scared, man. What if I can't change? I get it, Daniel replied. But you don't have to do it alone. You've got people around you who care. I care. We'll get through it, one step at a time. For the first time that day, Marcus's shoulders relaxed a little. He looked at Daniel, nodding slowly, like he was finally starting to believe in the possibility of a different path. The conversation didn't solve everything. Marcus didn't suddenly find all the answers that night. But something had changed in him. Maybe it was the simple fact that Daniel had shown up for him when he needed someone to talk to, that he hadn't just walked by. Maybe it was the reminder that he didn't have to face this alone. Whatever it was, Marcus seemed to have found a small ember of hope to hold on to. That night, Daniel walked home with a mix of emotions swirling in his chest. He had done what he could for Marcus, but he also knew how delicate this process was. It wasn't just about offering words of encouragement. It was about walking the journey with him, showing him that there was a way forward. But as Daniel thought about how far he had come, he realized something. Maybe the journey was never about getting everything right. It was about staying in the fight, even when things seemed impossible. The next morning, Daniel arrived at work a little early, feeling more energized than usual. There was a new energy in him, a drive to not only improve his own life but to help others do the same. As he entered the store, he was greeted by Greg, who immediately pulled him aside. "Hey, Daniel, can I talk to you for a minute?" Greg asked, his tone serious. "Sure, what's up?" Daniel replied, sensing something important. Greg took a deep breath before speaking. "I've been thinking about your role here. I've seen the way you've stepped up, not just in the work you do, but in how you've been helping others. I think you're ready for more responsibility. I want to offer you a promotion. You'd be working more closely with the team, maybe even helping out with some of the new guys who start here." Daniel was stunned. He hadn't expected anything like this. "A promotion? Are you sure?" Greg smiled. "Absolutely. I've seen how much you've grown. You're more than just someone who shows up for the paycheck. You're a leader in the making, and I want to give you the opportunity to prove it." Daniel felt a surge of gratitude wash over him. This was more than just a job offer. It was validation. It was proof that he was on the right path, that the hard work was paying off. And most importantly, it was a chance to help others in a bigger way. That night, as Daniel lay in bed, his mind raced. He thought about Marcus, about how he had almost given up on himself. He thought about his own struggles, the doubts he had overcome. And he thought about how much he had changed, not just in his circumstances, but in his heart. Things were never going to be perfect, but they didn't need to be. What mattered was that he was moving forward, and in helping others do the same, he was finding a purpose that made all the hardships worth it. The days following Daniel's promotion were a whirlwind. It wasn't just about doing his job well anymore. It was about setting an example. Every time he walked into the store, he felt the weight of expectations. Greg was watching. His coworkers were watching. Marcus, who had begun to slowly rebuild his life, was watching. It was a lot to take in. That morning, Daniel walked into the store feeling a bit overwhelmed. The promotion, though a step forward in his journey, came with its own set of challenges. He wasn't just managing the work anymore. He was supposed to inspire and lead others. And for someone who had spent so long surviving, being asked to lead felt like a daunting task. Could he really be someone others could look up to? Could he make a difference in their lives, like Greg had done for him? As Daniel made his way to the back of the store to grab his apron, Greg met him at the door. "Morning, Daniel," Greg said with a smile, but Daniel could see the seriousness behind his eyes. "Morning, Greg," Daniel replied, forcing a smile. "What's going on?" "I wanted to talk to you about the new guys we're bringing in. A few more people are joining the team, and I want you to work with them. Show them the ropes. You've got the experience, and I think you're the right person to help them adjust." Daniel nodded, trying to push past the sudden anxiety creeping up in his chest. "Sure, I'll do my best." Greg clapped him on the back. "I know you will." As Greg walked off, Daniel felt a rush of conflicting emotions. He knew he had come a long way, but leading others, people who were in the same position he had been not long ago, felt like a much bigger challenge. What if he couldn't teach them what they needed to know? What if they didn't take him seriously? Or worse, what if they ended up failing like he had so many times before? Later that afternoon, the new team members arrived. They were a mix of ages, backgrounds, and personalities, But they all shared one thing in common. They were trying to get back on their feet. Some had been through rough patches with addiction, others with difficult family situations, and a few were simply looking for a fresh start. One of the new guys was named Tyler. He was in his late 20s, with a strong build and an easy smile. He looked like the kind of guy who could blend in anywhere, but there was something about the way he carried himself, like he was on edge, like the weight of his past was a constant burden he couldn't shake off. "Hey, I'm Daniel," he said, offering Tyler a handshake. "I'll be helping you out today." Tyler shook his hand, his grip firm, but his eyes seemed distant. "Yeah, thanks. I've been out of work for a while, so I'm just trying to get back into the swing of things." Daniel smiled, trying to put him at ease. "Don't worry, man. We've all been there. Just take it one step at a time." As the day went on, Daniel worked alongside Tyler and the others, showing them how things worked, answering questions, and giving advice. It was a lot of responsibility, but Daniel had been through enough to know that sometimes just showing someone that you believed in them could make all the difference. But the real test came later that afternoon. Tyler was struggling to keep up with the pace of the work. He seemed frustrated, his movements sharp and erratic. Every time he dropped something or made a mistake, he muttered under his breath in frustration. Daniel noticed, but he didn't say anything right away. He gave Tyler space to get it right on his own. He knew what it felt like to be overwhelmed, to want to quit when things got tough. But if Tyler was going to get through this, he needed to find his own way, just like Daniel had to. By the end of the day, Tyler was clearly upset. As they were packing up to leave, he approached Daniel, his face a mix of embarrassment and frustration. "I don't think I'm cut out for this," Tyler said, running a hand through his hair. "I keep messing up. I'm just not getting it." Daniel paused, looking at him for a long moment. He could see the struggle in Tyler's eyes. It was the same fight Daniel had seen in himself 100 times. "You're doing fine," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. "It's okay to mess up. We all do. What matters is that you keep going. You're not going to get it perfect on day one." "Hell, I didn't get it perfect on day one." Tyler shook his head, clearly frustrated with himself. "But I should be better. I should have figured it out by now." Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice a bit so only Tyler could hear. "I get it. But what you're missing is that nobody expects you to be perfect. They just want to see you try. That's what I've learned over these last few months. You don't have to have everything figured out. You just have to keep moving forward." Tyler looked at him, his expression softening just a little. "Thanks, man. I needed to hear that." Daniel nodded. "Anytime." As Daniel left the store that night, he couldn't help but reflect on the conversation with Tyler. It had been a reminder that the journey was never easy, even for those who appeared to have it all together. Everyone had their own struggles, their own demons to face. But what mattered was that they didn't face it alone. As he walked back toward his apartment, he thought about how much he had grown since that day he first asked Trump for $1. He had gone from a man on the street, asking for help, to someone who could offer it. He had learned that no matter how tough things got, there was always a chance for change. And it wasn't about being perfect, it was about showing up, doing the work, and helping others along the way. Daniel's life had taken unexpected turns. What started as a small shift from the streets to a job at a local store had blossomed into something much bigger. He was no longer just trying to survive day by day. He was building a future. And yet, despite all the progress he had made, the weight of old habits and emotions still lingered in the background, threatening to derail everything he had worked for. The night after his conversation with Tyler, Daniel couldn't shake off a feeling of unease. He lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. He had helped Tyler, no doubt about that, but something about the way he had reacted had unsettled him. Tyler had seemed so quick to blame himself, to feel like he wasn't good enough. Daniel understood that feeling all too well. It wasn't just Tyler. It was everyone around him. Every day, he watched people beat themselves up for mistakes, for missteps, for moments of weakness. He knew how hard it was to break the cycle of self-doubt, of feeling like you were never enough. It was the same cycle he had battled for years. And sometimes, even now, the old Daniel would resurface, the one who felt like he didn't belong, the one who couldn't imagine ever being worthy of success or happiness. The next morning, Daniel went into work early, hoping to get a few quiet moments before the store became busy. He grabbed a cup of coffee and sat at the back, looking out over the store. The space was familiar, but somehow it felt different now. He wasn't just a part of the team anymore. He was expected to lead. A soft knock on the doorframe startled him. "Hey, you got a minute?" Greg stood in the doorway, his usual smile on his face, but there was a certain weight in his eyes today. "Yeah, of course," Daniel said, straightening up. He knew something was coming. Greg never came to him with a light topic. "Listen, I've been thinking about the new hires, and I've noticed something," Greg started, walking in and taking a seat across from Daniel. "I've seen you working with them, especially with Tyler, and I can tell you've got a real gift for connecting with people. But I also see that you've got some of your own stuff going on, stuff you don't talk about much." Daniel was silent, surprised by the insight Greg had into his situation. He had always kept his personal struggles close to his chest. The last thing he wanted was for his coworkers to see the cracks beneath his calm exterior. Greg leaned in a little, his voice lowering. "It's okay, Daniel. You don't have to carry everything on your own. I know you're doing great, but you can't help others if you're not taking care of yourself, too. You've come so far, but I think it's time to address the things you're still holding on to." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't easy to admit, but Greg was right. There were days when Daniel felt like he was still the same broken person he had been before, the one who didn't feel worthy of a second chance. "I don't know what you mean," Daniel said quietly, though his voice betrayed him. Greg's words were hitting closer to home than he cared to admit. Greg sat back, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment before speaking again. "You've got more people depending on you now, not just at work, but in your personal life. I know you've been helping Marcus, and now Tyler. You've been giving so much of yourself, but sometimes you've got to be real with the people around you, and with yourself, if you want to keep moving forward." Daniel was quiet for a long time, thinking about what Greg had said. He knew that Greg wasn't asking for some grand revelation, but it felt like the weight of the world had been placed on his shoulders. How could he help others when he still hadn't fully figured out his own life? The rest of the day passed in a blur. Daniel kept his head down, working hard, trying to focus on the task at hand. But the conversation with Greg stayed with him. It was a conversation he had been avoiding for months, the one where he finally faced the reality of his past, his fears, and the pain he had buried so deep. That night, after work, Daniel sat on a bench outside the store, watching the traffic flow by. It was a cool evening, the sky darkening with the first signs of winter. His breath came out in soft clouds, and he wrapped his jacket tighter around himself. His mind kept circling back to one question. How much longer could he keep running from his past? He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, stopping on Marcus's name. He hadn't checked in with him in a few days, and Daniel knew that he couldn't ask anyone else for help unless he was willing to open up, too. He hit the call button. It took a few rings before Marcus picked up. His voice was groggy at first, as though he had just woken up. "Hey man," Marcus said, his tone tired but warm. "What's up?" "Hey, Marcus," Daniel began, trying to keep his voice steady. "You doing all right?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Yeah, I'm good. You know, still figuring things out." Daniel nodded, though Marcus couldn't see him. "Listen, I know you've been struggling, but I wanted to ask you something, and it's probably going to sound weird." "Sure, what's up?" Marcus asked, his voice curious now. "I've been trying to help people around me. Guys at work, people like you, people like me," Daniel said, feeling the weight of his words. "But I think I've been avoiding something. I don't talk about my own stuff, you know? The stuff from the past. But I can't keep pretending it doesn't affect me anymore." Marcus's voice softened. "Man, it's okay. We've all got things we're carrying. I'm still carrying mine, too. You don't have to carry it alone." Daniel smiled to himself, surprised by how easy it was to open up to Marcus. Maybe it was because he knew Marcus was walking the same path, still finding his way out of the darkness. "I guess I just needed to hear that from someone," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't always know what I'm doing, you know? I'm still trying to figure it out." "Me too," Marcus replied, "but I think we're doing all right." As Daniel ended the call, he sat there for a long time, thinking. Maybe he wasn't as alone as he had once believed. Maybe it wasn't about being perfect or having all the answers. It was about showing up, being vulnerable, and allowing others to help when they could. And in turn, offering help to those who needed it. Daniel had spent so long thinking he had to do everything on his own. But for the first time in a long while, he realized that he didn't have to. He had people in his corner: Greg, Marcus, even Tyler. He wasn't just leading a new life. He was learning how to live it, day by day, together with others. It was early morning when Daniel woke up, his mind already buzzing with thoughts from the night before. The conversation with Marcus had been unexpectedly liberating. It was strange. He had reached out for support, but instead of feeling weak, he had felt empowered. It was the first time in a long while that he allowed himself to be vulnerable with someone else. Yet, as the sunlight poured through his window, Daniel couldn't help but feel a familiar wave of doubt creeping in. Was he really on the right path? Was he really helping people? Or was he just distracting himself from his own problems? He had gotten used to pushing those feelings aside, to focusing on others rather than dealing with his own inner turmoil. But now, after his talk with Greg and Marcus, he couldn't ignore the reality any longer. The truth was, he had made progress. But he wasn't finished yet. That day, as Daniel walked into the store, the weight of the unspoken hung in the air. He had a job to do. He had people depending on him. But at that moment, there was something else, something that had been bothering him for a while. The trust he had in himself. His new role had brought out the best in him in some ways, but it also demanded more than he was used to. People trusted him now, not just as a co-worker, but as a leader. And every day, he asked himself if he could live up to that trust. He had seen too many people give up on themselves in the past, especially the ones he was trying to help. Tyler had been struggling, and Marcus, though improving, was still fighting his own battles. They all needed guidance, but he needed it too. That afternoon, Greg stopped him for a quick word, pulling him aside just as Daniel was about to clock out. "Hey, Daniel, got a minute?" Greg asked, a slight smile on his face. "Yeah, sure," Daniel replied, wiping his hands on his apron before taking a step toward him. Greg led him to the break room, where the quiet hum of the refrigerators and the soft sound of footsteps filled the air. "I've been hearing some good things about you," Greg began, sitting down on the edge of the table. "From the new guys, from the team. Everyone's impressed with how you're handling the responsibility." Daniel's chest swelled with pride, but the self-doubt still lingered. "Thanks, Greg, but you know I'm still figuring it all out. I don't have all the answers." Greg's smile didn't fade. "That's exactly why you're doing so well. You don't pretend to have it all figured out. You show up every day, and you help others do the same. Trust is the foundation of leadership, Daniel. And trust isn't about knowing everything. It's about being there when it counts." Daniel's eyes dropped to the floor, absorbing Greg's words. "You really think I'm ready for this?" Greg chuckled softly, leaning forward. "I know you are, but I also know it's tough. You don't have to be perfect. What's important is that you trust yourself, just like the people around you trust you." As Greg left, Daniel was left with his own thoughts. Trust. It was a word he had heard a lot in the past few months, but the truth was, it still didn't come easily to him. Trusting others was one thing, but trusting himself was an entirely different challenge. As he locked up the store later that evening, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Marcus. "Hey man, thanks again for talking earlier. I really needed it. Let's grab coffee tomorrow if you're free." Daniel smiled at the message, feeling a warmth in his chest. It was small moments like this that kept him going, kept him believing in the work he was doing. He replied quickly, "Anytime, Marcus. I'll be there." The next day, Daniel met Marcus at a small cafe downtown. It was a quiet spot, tucked away from the busy streets, a place that felt like a secret retreat from the noise of the world. "Hey man," Daniel greeted as he spotted Marcus at the table by the window. "Hey," Marcus waved. His face lit up with a hint of excitement. "Thanks for meeting me." "No problem. What's on your mind?" Daniel asked, sitting down across from him. Marcus fiddled with the edge of his cup before looking up. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said yesterday, about not needing to be perfect." Daniel raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Yeah? What about it?" Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair. I guess. I guess I never really thought about it that way. I've been so focused on fixing everything at once, trying to be this perfect version of myself, but it's just too much pressure. It feels like I'm always falling short. Daniel nodded, leaning forward slightly. I get that. Believe me, it's easy to think you have to fix everything at once, but it doesn't work like that. You've got to take it day by day, step by step. Marcus smiled a little, his shoulders relaxing. Yeah, it sounds a lot simpler when you put it that way. That's the key, Daniel said, pausing to take a sip of his coffee. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to keep showing up. Keep making progress, even if it's small. For a moment, the two men sat in silence, the weight of their conversation sinking in. So, what's next for you? Daniel asked after a beat. Any plans? Marcus shrugged, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. I think I'm going to start by getting back into therapy. I've been avoiding it for too long. And, maybe I'll take a step back and just focus on staying sober. One day at a time. Daniel smiled. That's the right mindset. One day at a time. As the conversation drifted to lighter topics, Daniel felt a sense of peace settle over him. Here he was, sitting with a guy who just months ago had been in the same position he had been in. Lost, searching for direction. And now, Marcus was starting to find his way. But more importantly, Daniel realized he had come a long way too. He had helped Marcus by showing him it was okay to be imperfect, but in the process, he had also helped himself. He had taken his own advice. He had shown up, even when it was hard. He had trusted the process. And now, he was beginning to trust himself. Later that evening, as Daniel sat on his couch, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He thought about the nights he spent on the streets, the feeling of desperation that had once consumed him. But now, that desperation had been replaced by something new, something he hadn't expected, a sense of purpose. And more than that, a sense of peace. He wasn't perfect. He didn't have all the answers. But for the first time in his life, Daniel felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. And that was enough. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Daniel woke up, the sunlight streaming through the blinds in his small apartment. His phone buzzed beside him on the nightstand, and he reached over to check it. It was a text from Greg. Hey Daniel, you free for a quick chat today? Got a few things I want to go over with you. Daniel rubbed his eyes, still groggy, but he quickly typed back. Sure. What time? How about noon? I'll be at the store. Daniel sighed, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle over him. The promotion, the work, the expectations. Sometimes it all felt like too much. But deep down, he knew he wasn't just doing this for the job. He was doing it because he believed in the people around him, and he knew that his journey had brought him to a point where he could give back. By noon, Daniel was at the store. The place had become a second home, the steady rhythm of daily tasks now comforting instead of overwhelming. He found Greg in the break room, standing by the coffee machine, a serious look on his face. Hey, Greg, Daniel said, walking in and pouring himself a cup. You wanted to talk? Yeah, Greg said, his voice calm but direct. I've been watching how you've been handling things, and I've got to say, you're doing a great job. But I can see you're also carrying a lot on your shoulders. And frankly, I'm worried. Daniel leaned back, sipping his coffee. Worried? About what? Greg sat down at the table across from him, his gaze intense. You're taking on too much, Daniel. You're still putting everyone else's needs ahead of your own, and it's starting to show. You've been going above and beyond for the team, but you're not taking care of yourself the way you should. Daniel opened his mouth to protest, but Greg cut him off. I know. You think you're doing what's best for everyone, but if you're not careful, you're going to burn out. You've already made so much progress, but you've got to trust yourself and the people around you more. You're not alone in this, man. Daniel paused, the truth of Greg's words hitting him harder than he expected. I've just been so focused on making sure I don't mess up, Daniel admitted, his voice quieter than usual. I don't want to let anyone down. I keep pushing, trying to be the guy everyone can depend on. But sometimes it feels like I'm losing myself in the process. Greg nodded, his expression softening. It's okay to need help, Daniel. And it's okay to take a step back. You've got a team now, People who believe in you. You don't have to do it all by yourself. Daniel looked down into his cup of coffee, trying to process everything. For so long, he had been the one to pick up the pieces, the one who had no choice but to carry everything on his own. He'd learned to survive, to push through, but he'd never really learned how to lean on others. Trust had always been the hardest thing for him. Later that afternoon, after Greg's talk, Daniel decided to take a walk. The cool autumn air filled his lungs as he wandered through the neighborhood. It felt good to get away from the store for a while, to clear his head. The city was bustling, people moving in and out of shops, kids playing in the parks, and cars honking in the streets. For a moment, Daniel allowed himself to just breathe, to appreciate the quiet moments of his life. His phone buzzed again, breaking his reverie. It was a message from Tyler. "Hey, Daniel, can we talk? I know I've been a bit quiet lately. Just wanted to check in." Daniel smiled at the text. He had been concerned about Tyler. After their first few days together, the young man had seemed more withdrawn, struggling to keep up with the pace of the job. Daniel had given him space, but he was glad to see Tyler reaching out. "Sure, I'm free. Want to meet up?" "Yeah, I'll be at the diner down the street in about 30 minutes. When Daniel walked into the diner, he spotted Tyler sitting in a booth by the window, tapping his fingers nervously on the table. The young man looked up when Daniel walked in, his eyes a little tired but still hopeful. "Hey, man," Daniel greeted, sliding into the seat across from him. "How you doing?" Tyler shrugged but managed a small smile. "I'm good. Just thinking, you know?" Daniel nodded, picking up the menu even though he wasn't really hungry. "I get that. What's on your mind?" Tyler hesitated for a moment, then met Daniel's gaze. "I've been thinking about the whole thing with work, and I don't know. I guess I'm scared. I feel like I'm never going to catch up. Like I'm always a step behind, and I'm just going to mess up again." Daniel leaned in, his voice calm but firm. "Tyler, listen to me. You're doing better than you think. We all start somewhere, and it's okay to take things slow. Nobody expects you to be perfect. Hell, I'm still figuring things out myself. But the fact that you're here, that you're willing to show up every day, that's something to be proud of." Tyler looked down, his fingers still nervously tapping on the table. I don't know. I keep thinking about what you said about just taking it one step at a time, but sometimes it feels like I'm stuck in the past, like nothing's ever going to change." Daniel reached across the table and put a hand on Tyler's. "Change doesn't happen overnight, man. It takes time. And sometimes, the biggest change is learning to trust yourself. It's about knowing that even on the days when it feels like nothing is moving forward, something is. You just have to keep going, even if it's only one small step." Tyler sat back, taking in Daniel's words. "You really think so?" Daniel smiled, leaning back in his seat. "I know so. Trust me. I've been where you are. It gets easier. You just have to keep showing up, one step at a time." As they finished their coffee and talked about everything from work to life outside of it, Daniel felt a sense of peace settle in him. Tyler wasn't the only one struggling to trust himself. Daniel had spent so much time doubting his worth that it had almost become second nature. But now, he was learning, not just how to help others, but how to give himself the grace he deserved. That night, after meeting with Tyler, Daniel walked home, the streets quiet and peaceful. He thought about everything that had brought him to this point, the pain, the setbacks, the moments of doubt. But there was something else now, something he hadn't known before: hope. He had learned to trust in the people around him, but most importantly, he was starting to trust himself. It wasn't going to be easy, and he knew there would be more challenges ahead. But for the first time in his life, Daniel felt like he had the strength to face whatever came his way. The days that followed were a whirlwind for Daniel. He had felt the shift in himself, the slow realization that he wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was beginning to thrive. But like any journey, there were still bumps along the road. The test of trust, of faith in himself and in others, was always lurking, ready to challenge the progress he'd made. It was one of those chilly mornings in early November when the first real challenge arose. The store was busy, more than usual, with customers filling every aisle and the phones ringing off the hook. Daniel had already been on his feet for several hours, but it wasn't the physical exhaustion that was starting to get to him. It was the mental fatigue. He was trying to stay on top of everything, keep the team motivated, resolve customer complaints, manage inventory, and all while ensuring that he didn't drop the ball on the personal relationships that had begun to shape his recovery. But, as always, it felt like there wasn't enough time in the day to do everything he had to. And that was when it happened. It was around noon when Tyler came in, looking more out of sorts than usual. He wasn't his usual upbeat self, and his eyes were downcast as he approached the back office, where Daniel was standing by the computer, updating schedules. "Hey, Tyler, what's going on?" Daniel called out, catching sight of him. Tyler hesitated, glancing toward the back door. I don't know, man. I'm just not feeling it today. I can't seem to focus, and I feel like I'm messing up everything. I don't think I can do this today." Daniel felt a twinge of panic, though he tried to hide it. He had grown attached to Tyler's progress and had seen how much potential he had. But now, it felt like one misstep was enough to derail everything. "Tyler, look," Daniel began, taking a step toward him, his voice softer now. "Everyone has bad days. It's okay. But if you're really struggling, I need you to talk to me. Let me know what's going on. Don't keep it bottled up." Tyler shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable. I've been feeling overwhelmed. I don't know if I'm cut out for this. The job, the pressure. I keep feeling like I'm just one mistake away from being out of here." Daniel's heart sank. He had been there before. He had felt that same crushing weight of not being enough, of fearing failure with every breath. But now, he had to be the one to show Tyler that failure wasn't the end. It was just part of the process. "Tyler, you're not alone in this," Daniel said, his voice steady. "I've been where you are, feeling like every mistake was the end of the road. But I'm telling you, that's not how this works. You have a team here that believes in you. I believe in you. But you've got to believe in yourself, too." Tyler didn't meet his eyes, still avoiding the conversation. "Listen," Daniel continued, placing a hand on Tyler's shoulder. "It's okay to have doubts, but you're not going to get anywhere if you don't try. You're stronger than you think. We've all got your back here. You don't have to do this by yourself." The conversation left Daniel with more questions than answers. Tyler had left soon after, saying he needed to go home and think things over. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play. Tyler had made such strides, so what had triggered this sudden regression? Was he simply overwhelmed? Or was there something else? Something that Daniel hadn't yet uncovered? As the workday wore on, the tension between his personal and professional responsibilities began to grow. By the time Greg came into the office later that afternoon, Daniel was visibly worn out, his mind still occupied by Tyler's sudden crisis. "Hey, you good?" Greg asked, his usual casual demeanor softened with concern. Daniel leaned against the desk, massaging his temples. "I don't know. Tyler's having a rough day. It's like everything we've worked on has just unraveled in the span of a few hours. I don't know how to help him." Greg nodded, understanding immediately. "You can't fix everything for him, Daniel. Sometimes, you've just got to let people work through their own stuff. But don't lose sight of the progress Tyler's made. And don't lose sight of your own progress either." Daniel looked up, his brow furrowed. "But I thought I had him figured out. I thought he was ready. And now he's talking about quitting. People relapse, Daniel. Not just in addiction, but in life. Tyler is no different. But the fact that he's asking for help, that's a good sign. It means he's still fighting, even if he doesn't realize it." Daniel sighed, feeling both the weight of his own responsibilities and the burden of trying to save someone else. He'd been through the same emotional ringer himself, but he didn't want Tyler to make the same mistakes. He didn't want him to give up. Greg placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You're doing the right thing by sticking with him, but you can't carry his weight for him. And you can't carry it all for the team, either. It's okay to lean on the people around you." As the evening wound down, Daniel sat alone in the office, the store finally quiet. His mind raced through all the advice he had been given, the conversations with Greg, Marcus, and even Tyler. But nothing seemed to make the weight in his chest feel lighter. He picked up his phone and dialed Marcus' number. He needed to talk it out. "Hey, man," Marcus answered after a couple of rings. "What's up?" "I'm just feeling a little overwhelmed," Daniel admitted, leaning back in his chair. Tyler's struggling, and I don't know how to help him. I'm just not sure what I'm supposed to be doing. There was a pause on the other end. Then Marcus spoke, his voice steady. You don't have to have all the answers, Daniel. You just have to be there. You've been through this. You know what it's like. Tyler's not looking for a fix. He's looking for support. He's looking for someone to say, I get it. Daniel sat silently, taking in Marcus' words. He realized, with a kind of quiet relief, that he didn't have to be the perfect mentor, the perfect leader. He just had to show up. The next morning, Daniel called Tyler and asked if they could meet up again. This time, he wasn't coming with a speech or a plan. He was just going to show up and listen. When they sat down at a small cafe, Tyler looked at him cautiously, his expression still full of uncertainty. Hey, Daniel started, his voice gentle. I just wanted to say, I'm here for you. Whatever you're going through, we're in this together. You don't have to do it alone. Tyler looked down at his coffee, his fingers wrapping around the cup as if seeking comfort from its warmth. I don't know, man. I just feel like I'm letting everyone down. Like I'm not good enough for this. Daniel reached across the table, placing his hand on Tyler's. You're not alone. I've been where you are. I've had those same doubts. But that's what makes us human. We mess up. We struggle. But we keep moving forward, step by step. And I know you can do that too. Tyler's eyes met his, a flicker of hope behind the uncertainty. You're right, Tyler said quietly, his voice soft but steady. I can do this. I just need to believe in myself again. As Daniel walked away from the cafe that morning, he felt lighter. It wasn't about fixing people. It was about being there for them, offering the support they needed to find their own way. And in doing so, he was slowly learning to trust himself, his ability to listen, to support, and most importantly, to keep showing up. He wasn't perfect, but he didn't need to be. The following week brought a storm of challenges. It was almost as if the universe had decided to test Daniel's resolve all at once. He had been riding high on his recent growth, the success of his new approach to work and leadership giving him a sense of purpose. But as the saying goes, the higher you rise, the harder you fall. And Daniel felt himself starting to falter. It was a Tuesday morning when the real trouble started. The store was understaffed, as usual. Daniel had hoped that the new hires would make a difference, but many were still learning the ropes and were far from being able to manage the floor independently. On top of that, a huge shipment of products had arrived late, and the inventory team was stretched thin trying to sort it all out. Then, of course, there were the customers. Always the customers. One particularly difficult customer had been causing a scene in the electronics aisle, loudly complaining about the price of an item that had been clearly marked with a discount. Daniel had already spoken to the customer once, trying to calm them down, but the situation had escalated, and now the man was shouting across the store. This is ridiculous, the man screamed. You people are trying to scam me. I'm never shopping here again. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and walked over to him. His chest tightened, a familiar feeling of stress creeping in. Not today, he thought. I can't afford a scene today. Sir, I'm sorry for the confusion, Daniel began, his voice calm but firm. If you'll just come with me, I'll make sure we get this sorted out right away. But the man was having none of it. I don't want to talk to you. You're all crooks. He gestured dramatically, his voice rising even higher. I'm going to report you to corporate. You'll see. Daniel's face flushed. He could feel the tension in the air, the eyes of other customers on him, and the weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders. He'd had enough. Something inside him snapped. Sir, we can resolve this calmly, or you can leave the store, Daniel said, his words sharp and controlled. The man stared at him, then looked around at the growing crowd of onlookers. The sight of Daniel standing his ground, firm and unwavering, seemed to give the man pause. But then, just as quickly, the customer's eyes shifted, and with a sneer, he tossed the product on the counter and stormed out, muttering curses under his breath. Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His body was stiff with adrenaline, and his mind was racing. He wasn't sure if he'd handled the situation perfectly, but in that moment, it felt like a victory. The store settled into a tense calm after the altercation. But it didn't last long. Daniel's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Greg. Got some bad news. Our biggest client is pulling their contract. They're moving to a competitor. Daniel's heart sank. The store's recent growth had been heavily supported by that contract, and losing it could set them back months, maybe longer. He quickly typed back, "How serious is it?" "Very. They're serious. We need to figure out how to make up for the loss, or we could be in trouble. We need to talk. Now." Daniel walked to the break room, trying to steady his nerves. The weight of the situation was overwhelming. His thoughts began to race. How would they recover from this? What could he possibly do to fix this? His mind was 1,000 miles ahead of his body, and by the time he reached the break room, he could feel the pounding in his temples. Greg was already there, standing with his arms crossed, a worried expression on his face. "We're going to have to dig deep for this one, Daniel. You know this isn't just about making up lost revenue. It's about the team. It's about staying motivated when things are at their worst." Daniel nodded, but couldn't find the words. His thoughts were consumed with the panic of losing the account. They had worked so hard to build up that relationship, and now it felt like it was slipping away in an instant. He didn't want to think about what would happen if they couldn't recover. "We need a plan," Greg continued, pacing the room. "This is going to take all hands on deck, but we've got to figure out how to stabilize the business while we look for new clients." That evening, Daniel couldn't sleep. His mind wouldn't stop worrying, replaying every conversation he'd had with the client, every missed opportunity. The thought of losing everything, the store, the team, the progress he'd made, sent waves of dread crashing through his chest. But as he lay there in the dark, one thought persisted. "I can't let it fall apart now. I've come too far." He had promised himself he wouldn't give up again. Not like before. Not after everything he had fought for. The next day, Daniel came in early. He gathered the team together for an impromptu meeting, a heavy sense of responsibility settling over him. It was time to act. "All right, everyone, listen up," Daniel said, standing in front of his team. "We've hit a major roadblock, but I know we can turn this around. We've built something strong here, and I believe in every single one of you. We're going to have to work together more than ever, and I'm counting on all of you." The team was quiet, the weight of the news still hanging in the air. But Daniel could see the flicker of determination in their eyes. They weren't going to just let this be the end. Greg stood beside him. "We'll need to work quickly. We'll be reaching out to every lead we have. We're also going to do everything we can to keep the clients we have engaged. I know it's going to be tough, but we've been through tough before. Let's show up and prove we've got what it takes." Over the next few days, the team pulled together in a way Daniel hadn't anticipated. The weight of the situation had ignited a fire in all of them. Even Tyler, who had been struggling with his own self-doubt, stepped up. The young man took on extra shifts, reached out to clients, and worked with the team on new marketing strategies. Daniel could see the shift in him. Tyler wasn't just trying to survive anymore. He was fighting for the success of the whole team, and that made all the difference. As for Daniel, he was beginning to see the cracks in his own carefully built armor. The pressure of holding everything together was taking its toll. The constant stress was wearing him down, and he could feel his energy slipping away. The sleepless nights, the long hours, it was all starting to add up. But there was no room for weakness. Not yet. Not while they were in the middle of this battle. It was 2 weeks later when Daniel finally hit his breaking point. He'd been running on fumes, barely sleeping, skipping meals, pushing his team harder than ever before. The pressure was relentless, and his nerves were frayed. It was a Friday afternoon when it happened. He was standing in the aisle, trying to help a customer who was asking about a product, when suddenly everything went black. The next thing he knew, he was on the floor, Greg and a few others standing over him, their faces filled with concern. "Daniel, are you all right?" Greg asked, his voice tight. Daniel blinked, disoriented, feeling weak and dizzy. I think so. I don't know what happened." "You've been pushing yourself too hard," Greg said, kneeling beside him. "You need to rest, man. You're not invincible." Daniel took a deep breath and slowly sat up, trying to clear the fog from his head. For the first time in a long while, he realized that he wasn't invincible, and it was okay. As he left the store later that day, Daniel knew he had to make a change. He couldn't keep going like this, burying himself in the work, trying to fix everyone else's problems without taking care of his own. He needed to learn how to find balance, how to step back, and most importantly, how to lean on his team when he couldn't do it all alone. But that night, as he lay in bed, the weight of the world pressing down on him, he finally understood something crucial. He was never alone in this fight. And that was the first step toward truly finding his strength. Daniel's decision to take a step back wasn't an easy one. He had always prided himself on being the one who could push through, no matter how tough things got. It was a part of who he was, something he had relied on for years. But after that fainting spell in the store, he realized that his approach had limits, and he had reached them. For the first time in a long while, he let himself rest. It started with a single day off. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Daniel to begin to recharge. He turned off his phone, left work behind, and spent the entire day in his apartment. No emails, no meetings, no schedules. Just quiet. He spent the morning in bed, reading a book he had picked up ages ago but never had the time to finish. He drank coffee slowly, savoring the quiet hum of the world outside. For a while, it was hard to relax. His mind kept racing, thinking of all the things he should be doing. But slowly, the quiet began to settle in, and for the first time in months, Daniel felt at ease. The next day, when he returned to work, it was with a new sense of clarity. He wasn't fully rested. He wasn't sure he could ever get back to where he had been before, that man who thought he could handle it all. But he knew now that rest was just as important as work. He didn't have to do it all. And more importantly, he didn't have to do it alone. That morning, he met with Greg and the team to go over their new strategy. Daniel had been working with them all week to figure out how to pick up the pieces after losing the big client. They had called every lead, reassured the clients they still had, and revamped their marketing efforts. The store was staying afloat, but it was still a huge uphill climb. But now, Daniel had a different perspective. "I know it's tough, but we've made it this far," Daniel said to the team as they sat around the conference table. "We've been through worse, and we've come out stronger. We can handle this." The team was quiet, their faces a mixture of hope and exhaustion. They had been running on empty for weeks, but Daniel could see the fire still burning in their eyes. There was no question. These people weren't ready to give up, and neither was he. "Here's what we're going to do," Daniel continued, his voice calm but determined. "We're going to double down on customer relationships. We'll focus on making every interaction meaningful. No more just getting by. We're going to rebuild, and we're going to do it together." He looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. "I can't do this without all of you. I need your help. We're going to make this work." The team nodded, some of them murmuring words of agreement. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Daniel felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. That afternoon, Tyler pulled Daniel aside. It had been a few days since their last conversation, and Tyler had been working hard to prove that he was more than capable. He had stepped up in ways that Daniel hadn't expected, taking on more responsibility, communicating with clients, and even helping train the new employees. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day," Tyler began, his voice hesitant but steady, "about not doing this alone. I know I've been kind of a mess lately, but I'm ready to step up. I want to help more." Daniel smiled at him, genuinely this time. "I've seen you step up already, Tyler, and I'm proud of you. You don't have to do it alone, either. We're all in this together." Tyler nodded, the weight of his own struggles lightening just a little. "Thanks, Daniel. I really appreciate that." As the days passed, Daniel leaned into his team, letting them take on more responsibility, giving them the freedom to make decisions without his constant oversight. It wasn't always easy. There were mistakes, misunderstandings, and frustrations along the way, but little by little, he began to see a change. The team was starting to believe in themselves as much as Daniel believed in them, and that made all the difference. 2 weeks later, the store had made significant progress. They had managed to secure a few new clients, and the remaining ones were more committed than ever to staying with them. The team had grown stronger, more cohesive. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were thriving. It was a Friday evening when the breakthrough came. Daniel was wrapping up the day, preparing to leave when Greg came into his office, a broad smile on his face. "We did it," Greg said, his voice almost disbelieving. We just got a contract offer from a company we've been courting for months. It's bigger than the one we lost." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "You're kidding." "I'm serious. They signed the papers just now," Greg said, holding up a contract with the company's logo on it. Daniel couldn't help the grin that spread across his face. "That's amazing." Greg laughed. "We couldn't have done it without your leadership. Seriously, you've been keeping the team together. We've all come a long way." Daniel shook his head, feeling a wave of humility wash over him. "It's not just me, Greg. It's all of us. Everyone here worked hard for this. We did it together." That evening, Daniel drove home with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The storm had passed, and they had made it through. But the journey wasn't over. He knew there would be more challenges ahead. But for the first time in months, Daniel felt like he was truly in control. Not because he was doing everything himself, but because he had learned to trust the people around him. As he sat down at his kitchen table, he thought back to everything that had led him here. The struggles, the doubts, the hard choices, and the lessons learned along the way. His journey wasn't perfect, but it had been his own. And now, with his team by his side, Daniel finally felt like he could take on whatever came next. But more than that, he understood the power of rest and balance. That sometimes, the best way forward wasn't to push harder but to step back, breathe, and let others help carry the load. The days following the contract signing felt like a breath of fresh air for Daniel and the entire team. They had not only survived the storm but had emerged stronger. The air in the store felt different now, lighter, more hopeful. Even the customers seemed to sense the shift, as if they could feel the renewed energy and confidence radiating from the team. Daniel was still careful, though. The last few months had taught him that success wasn't something you could just coast on. He couldn't afford to slip into complacency, not now that they were rebuilding. But the pressure he had once felt, the weight of carrying the business all on his own, had lightened, and that made all the difference. It was an early Monday morning when Daniel decided to check in with each department personally. He had gotten used to managing things remotely, but now, he wanted to be more involved. He needed to show the team that even as things improved, he wasn't going anywhere. His first stop was the inventory room, where Carla and a few others were working through the weekend's deliveries. "Morning, Carla," Daniel greeted her, his voice casual but friendly. "Morning, Daniel," she responded with a tired but warm smile. "We're almost caught up with everything. Thanks for the extra help last week. It made a big difference." "No problem at all," Daniel replied, his mind running through their plans for the next quarter. "I know it's been tough. How's the new system working out for you?" "It's getting there. The team is adjusting to it, but we're still smoothing out the kinks. Nothing we can't handle." "Great to hear," Daniel nodded, offering encouragement. "I'm here if you need anything. You guys are doing awesome work." As he walked away, he felt a quiet sense of pride. The team had found its rhythm, and it wasn't just him who had made it happen. It was all of them, coming together, supporting each other, and pushing forward. Next, he found himself in the break room, where Tyler was sitting with a couple of new employees. The young man had come a long way from the uncertain, anxious person who had barely been able to make eye contact in the early days. Now, he was confidently guiding others, answering questions, and cracking a joke or two to lighten the mood. Tyler looked up when Daniel entered. "Hey, boss. What's up?" "I was just checking in," Daniel said, leaning against the doorframe. "How are the new hires doing?" "Good. Really good, actually," Tyler said, his eyes lighting up. "I've been showing them the ropes, and they're picking things up fast. I think they're going to be a great fit." Daniel smiled, feeling an unexpected sense of relief. He had been nervous about the new team members, wondering if they'd mesh well with the existing staff. But Tyler seemed to be making it work, and that made all the difference. "Glad to hear it. Keep up the great work," Daniel said, giving Tyler a nod of approval. As he moved through the store, talking to employees, thanking them for their hard work, Daniel found himself reflecting on just how far they had come. A year ago, he wouldn't have believed this was possible. Back then, he had been so focused on survival, on the next crisis to tackle, that he had missed the bigger picture. But now, he saw it clearly. The store wasn't just a place for transactions. It was a community. And he wasn't the sole force holding it all together. It was all of them, working in sync, moving towards something bigger than themselves. That afternoon, Daniel sat down with Greg in the office to review their new plans for growth. The next few months were going to be crucial for their expansion, and they had to be strategic. Okay, Daniel said, pulling up their budget projections on his laptop. We've got the new contract, we're starting to see more foot traffic in the store, and the marketing campaigns are working. The next step is to focus on online sales. Greg nodded in agreement. We've been talking about this for months. I think now's the right time to invest in a better e-commerce platform. We can't just keep relying on foot traffic. We need to be able to reach customers wherever they are. Daniel leaned forward, excited by the possibilities. Exactly. And it's going to take a little more than just setting up an online store. We need a full digital strategy, targeted ads, SEO, maybe even influencer partnerships. Greg raised an eyebrow. Influencers? That's bold. Daniel chuckled. Yeah, I know, but it's what people are doing now. We're already seeing a younger crowd coming in, and they're all about authenticity. If we can partner with the right people, we could really push our online presence. By the end of the meeting, they had outlined a plan to revamp their digital marketing strategy, starting with the website overhaul. They would invest in targeted ads, improve their SEO, and explore partnerships with influencers who aligned with their brand's message of community and hard work. The plan wasn't without risk. It would require a significant investment of both time and money, but Daniel felt confident about it. More than anything, he trusted the team he had built. They were ready to tackle the challenges ahead. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The team was working harder than ever to keep up with the new goals, but there was a tangible sense of excitement in the air. Everyone was on board, and they were all feeling the momentum shift in their favor. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about thriving, and Daniel couldn't help but smile at the thought. Then came a pivotal moment, a reminder of how far they had come and how much further they could go. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Daniel received a call from a potential investor who had heard about the store's success. They had been following the store's progress for some time and were interested in a partnership that could take the business to the next level. The offer was a huge opportunity, one that could bring in the kind of capital they needed to expand the business even further. But it was also a bit overwhelming. They had worked so hard to build everything from the ground up, and the idea of handing over even a small piece of that to someone else felt like a huge decision. That evening, Daniel sat down with Greg, Tyler, and the rest of the team to discuss the offer. The decision was complicated, but Daniel knew that they had reached a point where they couldn't keep doing everything on their own. They needed a new level of support to truly grow. I don't know if we're ready for this, Daniel said, rubbing his temples. Taking on an investor means giving up a little control. It's a big step. Tyler spoke up first. You know, we've come this far because we all trusted each other. Maybe it's time we trust someone else, someone who can help us push even further. Greg nodded. It's a big risk, Daniel, but the way I see it, we've been managing everything ourselves for a long time. Maybe it's time to let someone else help us carry the load. After much deliberation, they all agreed. They would move forward with the investor, but they would do so cautiously, ensuring that their values and vision for the store remained intact. It was the right move, they believed. They had built something special, and now it was time to let it grow. As Daniel sat back in his chair, looking at the team gathered around him, he felt a surge of pride. They had come so far from the uncertainty that had once defined them. They had learned to rely on each other, to lean into their strengths, and to work together toward a common goal. And as the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the store, Daniel couldn't help but think, this was just the beginning. The days after their decision to accept the investor's offer felt like they were in uncharted waters. On one hand, the new partnership promised to elevate their business in ways they had only dreamed of. On the other, the idea of relinquishing some control and inviting someone new into the fold stirred a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Daniel sat in his office, scrolling through emails, his mind buzzing with the logistics of the upcoming meeting with the investor. Greg had been in touch with them frequently, hammering out the details, but there was still a nagging feeling in Daniel's gut. This wasn't just a business deal. It was a pivotal moment in their journey. Would they lose the heart and soul of the business that had made them successful in the first place? Could they maintain the same culture, the same authenticity, with a larger financial force behind them? That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if they were making the right decision. He thought back to the early days, when the store had been small, just a modest idea in his head. Back then, it had been a labor of love, something he could control entirely. It had been his. And now, with an investor on board, that control was slipping away. Still, he knew it was the right thing to do for the business. They needed resources to grow, to expand their reach beyond what they could achieve on their own. It wasn't about selling out. It was about building something bigger, something sustainable. The meeting was set for the following week. The investor, a well-known businessman named Thomas Clarkson, was coming in to discuss the terms and begin the process of formalizing the partnership. Daniel was nervous, but he knew the team was behind him. They had all agreed that this was the next step in their journey. As the day of the meeting approached, Daniel found himself growing more and more confident. They had done the hard work. They had built a strong foundation. They had proven they could adapt, pivot, and fight when things got tough. Now, it was time to bring in the support they needed to take things to the next level. When Thomas Clarkson arrived, he wasn't what Daniel had expected. The man was older than he had imagined, his sharp suit and polished demeanor making him seem like the kind of person who was all business. But there was something in his eyes, an understanding, maybe even a hint of admiration, that put Daniel at ease. "Mr. Clarkson, welcome to the store," Daniel said, shaking his hand firmly. "Thank you, Daniel. It's a pleasure to meet you and your team," Thomas said, his voice low but confident. "I've been following your progress for a while now. I have to say, I'm impressed by what you've built here." Daniel gave a quick smile. "We've worked hard. It hasn't been easy, but we've made it through." As the meeting progressed, Thomas asked pointed questions, but there was no sense of condescension or pressure. He was genuinely interested in the store's operations, the team's dynamics, and Daniel's vision for the future. By the end of the discussion, it was clear that Thomas wasn't just looking to make a financial investment. He was looking to be a partner in the truest sense of the word. "I like what you've done here," Thomas said, leaning back in his chair. "And I think we can take this even further. But I want you to know this isn't about changing the culture of your business. It's about building on it. I've worked with many companies, but it's rare to find one with such a strong foundation. I'm here to help you grow, not to change what you've already created." Daniel exhaled in relief. This wasn't a power grab. It wasn't about tearing down what they had built. It was about expansion, about creating opportunities for everyone involved. When the meeting was over, Daniel and his team huddled together to discuss what had been agreed upon. There would be a financial infusion, yes, but it came with strings attached, chiefly the expectation of rapid growth. The timeline for expansion was aggressive, but Daniel wasn't deterred. They had faced bigger challenges before, and they had come out on top. The next few months passed in a blur. The new capital allowed them to hire more staff, improve the store's layout, and invest heavily in their online infrastructure. The e-commerce platform was overhauled, and targeted ads began to draw more customers to the website. They started offering online ordering for in-store pickup, which helped boost sales. Social media campaigns were running on all cylinders, and soon, the store's profile began to rise in ways Daniel had never anticipated. But with this new success came new pressures. The team was working at full capacity, and Daniel could feel the strain. The stress that had once been his alone was now shared by everyone. Greg, Carla, Tyler, everyone was stretched thin. They were working harder than ever to keep up with the demand. And though their efforts were paying off, Daniel knew that they couldn't maintain this pace forever. One afternoon, as Daniel was reviewing sales reports, he received a call from Greg. "Daniel, we need to talk," Greg said, his voice sounding unusually tense. "Sure, what's going on?" "There's something I think we need to address. We've been running nonstop, and the team is starting to feel it. People are getting burnt out. We need to figure out how to pace ourselves through this growth." Daniel leaned back in his chair, letting the gravity of Greg's words sink in. He had noticed the strain, of course, the tired eyes, the frustration, the small mistakes creeping into their work. He had just been too focused on the next goal to address it properly. "Okay," Daniel said, his voice steady but concerned. "Let's sit down and talk through it." That evening, Daniel called a meeting with the entire team. They gathered in the break room, the quiet murmur of their conversations fading as Daniel stood up to speak. "I know we've been pushing hard lately," Daniel began, looking around at the familiar faces of the people who had helped get the store this far. "And I know we're all excited about the growth we're seeing. But I also know that we're hitting a tipping point. We can't keep going at this pace without burning out." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed his words. "We need to find balance," Daniel continued. "It's not just about working harder, it's about working smarter. We're not in this to run ourselves into the ground. We're in this for the long haul." It was a pivotal moment for the team. Daniel realized that they had come so far, and now it was time to step back and recalibrate. Growth was important, but not at the expense of the people who had built the business. Over the next few weeks, Daniel implemented new measures to support the team. They hired more staff to alleviate some of the pressure, restructured shifts to ensure people were getting the breaks they needed, and even introduced wellness programs to help them manage stress. The balance they found between growth and well-being didn't come easily, but it was a turning point. Daniel learned that success wasn't just about pushing through. It was about knowing when to pause, to regroup, and to take care of those who had helped you get there. The months that followed were a whirlwind of growth, excitement, and challenges. The store's expansion was in full swing. With the new capital from the investor, Daniel had been able to implement ambitious plans, hiring more staff, improving inventory management, and ramping up marketing efforts. Business was booming, but as the store grew, so did the pressures. Daniel had always been a person who thrived under stress. He had learned to navigate the highs and lows of entrepreneurship, but now, with the business scaling faster than he had ever imagined, the toll was beginning to show. It wasn't just the work. It was the emotional weight of it all. One afternoon, as Daniel sat at his desk, reviewing quarterly projections, he noticed a few things that made him pause. The sales were up, no doubt. The e-commerce platform was bringing in more customers than ever before, and the store was thriving. But there was an underlying issue, one that he had ignored in his excitement about growth. Employee turnover was rising. The staff who had been with him since the beginning were starting to feel the strain. People were leaving, others were becoming disillusioned, and the once tight-knit team was beginning to show cracks. He couldn't ignore it anymore. It was a quiet Thursday evening when Daniel called a team meeting. The store was closed for the night, and the staff had gathered around the large wooden table in the break room. Daniel could sense the tension in the air. He had been receiving complaints, whispers of dissatisfaction, and some of the team members had pulled him aside privately. He knew it was time to address the elephant in the room. "Hey, everyone," Daniel began, his voice firm but empathetic. "I know things have been moving fast lately, and I've been so focused on growth that I may have missed something important. I want to talk about how you're all feeling." There was a pause. Carla was the first to speak. "It's been tough, Daniel. We've been working so much overtime, trying to keep up with everything. Some of us are burnt out. I think we're all just exhausted." Daniel nodded, feeling a pang of guilt. He knew that they were working hard, but he hadn't realized just how much it was affecting them. He had been so focused on expansion, on proving that they could do it, that he hadn't paid enough attention to the well-being of his team. "I get it," he said quietly. "I've noticed it too, and I'm sorry. I've been pushing everyone too hard, and I can't do that anymore. We need to find a better balance." The next few weeks were a time of introspection for Daniel. He spent less time focusing on sales numbers and more time listening to his team, to their concerns, to their ideas. He wanted to make sure that the store didn't just grow in size, but in heart as well. Daniel knew that to keep moving forward, he had to find a way to sustain the team's energy, not just their productivity. One of the first steps he took was to hire more people, especially for the back-end operations. Carla and the others in the inventory department had been working double shifts, struggling to keep up with the demand. Daniel brought in a new team to help with logistics and warehouse management, which allowed the existing staff to focus more on customer service and sales. The second thing he did was to implement a rotating schedule, ensuring that everyone got time off when they needed it. Long hours and burnout had become the norm, but Daniel understood now that the quality of their work and their happiness was more important than simply pushing through. He also introduced regular check-ins with each department, encouraging open communication and feedback. No one felt like they had to bottle up their frustrations or concerns anymore. It was a small change, but it had a huge impact. But even with these improvements, there was an underlying tension that Daniel couldn't shake. They had reached a tipping point where growth and success came at a steep price. The investor, Thomas Clarkson, had been pushing for even faster expansion. He saw the potential for the business to reach a national market, and while Daniel agreed that there was great potential, he also knew that they couldn't keep growing without addressing the foundational issues first. It was a rainy Friday afternoon when Thomas Clarkson arrived for his regular visit. He was eager to check on the store's progress, but Daniel had a sinking feeling in his stomach. He wasn't sure if they were ready for what Clarkson was about to suggest. After the initial pleasantries, Thomas wasted no time in getting to the point. "Daniel, I've been looking at the numbers, and I'm convinced that now is the time to take things to the next level. We need to scale faster, open more locations, increase our digital presence, start looking into franchising. I want to see this brand everywhere, and I want to do it in the next 12 to 18 months. Daniel listened intently, his mind racing. The idea of franchising had been something they had considered in the distant future, not in the immediate months. He felt the pressure mounting, the expectation from Clarkson that the business needed to grow exponentially. "Thomas," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice steady, "I agree with you. We've built something special here, and I know we're capable of more. But we've also reached a point where our team is feeling the strain. We've been working nonstop to keep up with everything, and I think we need to take a step back before we make any big moves." Thomas frowned, leaning forward in his chair. "I understand that, Daniel. But if we don't move quickly, we risk losing momentum. There are competitors out there who are expanding rapidly, and if we don't act fast, we could get left behind." Daniel paused, weighing his words carefully. "I get it, I do. But I also know that if we don't take care of the team, we're not going to be able to sustain any kind of growth. We need to make sure we're building something that lasts, not just something that looks good on paper." Thomas was silent for a moment, and Daniel could see the wheels turning in his mind. Finally, he spoke. "I hear you," Thomas said, "but I need to know that you're willing to push for growth. The clock is ticking, Daniel. We need to decide what direction we're going in." That night, Daniel stayed late at the store, sitting in the office alone. He stared at the spreadsheets, the numbers, the projections, all of it swirling around him. The decision before him wasn't just about finances or strategy. It was about what kind of company he wanted to run. Would they scale rapidly and risk burning out the team? Or would they slow down, focus on their people, and build a more sustainable future? Daniel had always been someone who took risks, who chased after the big dreams. But now, for the first time, he questioned if that was enough. As he sat there, lost in thought, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Tyler, his loyal team member, someone who had been with him since the very beginning. "Hey boss, just wanted to say thanks for everything. I know we've been working hard, but I appreciate you looking out for us. I think we're all ready to tackle whatever comes next. We've got your back." The message brought a small smile to Daniel's face, but it also reminded him of the weight of responsibility he carried. His team had come a long way, and they believed in him. But now, more than ever, Daniel knew that he needed to believe in them too. The days following the tense conversation with Thomas Clarkson weighed heavily on Daniel. Every decision seemed to carry an extra layer of consequence. He found himself in a constant battle between the ambition that had driven him to start the business and the responsibility he felt to the people who had helped him build it. He couldn't help but wonder if he was on the verge of a breakdown, one that had been slowly building for months. It was the middle of the week, and Daniel had just wrapped up a meeting with his marketing team. They were discussing the launch of a new ad campaign, one that would span across multiple states. It was exciting, really exciting. But as the meeting progressed, Daniel began to notice the same exhaustion he'd seen in his employees creeping into their faces. His marketing director, Emma, looked like she hadn't slept in days, and Greg, who had always been the voice of reason, kept rubbing his temples. After the meeting ended, Daniel found himself alone in his office. The team had dispersed, the noise of the store's day-to-day operations rising in the background. He sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen. Sales numbers, inventory reports, employee schedules. They were all on his mind, and they were starting to blur together. How much longer could they keep this pace up? Daniel had always prided himself on his ability to persevere, but lately, the weight of everything, his business, his relationships, his personal well-being, was beginning to feel unbearable. That evening, as he walked out of the office, Daniel's phone buzzed. It was a message from Carla, his longtime friend and manager of the store's front-end operations. "Daniel, we need to talk. I think it's time for a change. Let's chat tomorrow." His heart sank as he read the message. Carla had been a cornerstone of the business since day one. She had seen him through his highs and lows, always steady, always reliable. If she was asking for a change, it meant something serious was wrong. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the store early. He barely noticed the bustle of activity as he made his way to the back office. His mind was too preoccupied with Carla's message. What had happened? What had gone wrong? Carla was already waiting for him when he walked into the break room, her arms crossed, a serious look on her face. "Hey," Daniel greeted her, trying to sound casual, though the nerves were evident in his voice. "Hey," she replied, not offering a smile. She motioned for him to sit down. "Look, Daniel, I need to be honest with you. I think we've reached a breaking point here." Daniel's stomach twisted. "What do you mean? We've been pushing hard, but we're doing great. The numbers are strong. The team is okay, right?" Carla shook her head. "No, Daniel. The team is barely hanging on. People are tired, overwhelmed. I've seen it in their eyes. And it's not just the work. It's the pressure, the constant push to grow faster, bigger. You've been so focused on expansion, but you've lost sight of what made us successful in the first place. It's not about just making money. It's about the people. And I'm afraid we're about to lose the heart of the business if we keep going this way." Daniel sat back, feeling the weight of her words. He had known that things were tense, but hearing it from Carla, the person who had supported him through every step of this journey, was a wake-up call. "I didn't realize it had gotten this bad," he admitted, his voice quiet. "I guess I've been so focused on pushing forward, I forgot to check in on the team. I thought we could handle it, but maybe I was wrong." Carla sighed, her shoulders slumping as if the conversation had taken a physical toll on her as well. "I'm not saying you're wrong to want to grow, Daniel. We all want the business to succeed, but we can't just keep running at this pace. If we don't find a balance, we're going to burn out everyone, including you." Daniel sat in silence, letting her words sink in. He could feel the familiar weight of uncertainty creeping in, but there was also a sense of clarity. The truth was hard to hear, but it was the truth. They had reached a point where they needed to slow down, reassess, and rebuild. It was a humbling realization, and one that he had been avoiding. "I'm sorry, Carla," he said after a long pause. "I've let it get this far. I promise I'll make it right. We'll figure this out." Carla smiled weakly. "I'm not going anywhere, Daniel. I just want us to be able to breathe again." Later that day, Daniel called another team meeting. This time, it wasn't to discuss sales or expansion plans. It wasn't about growth or scaling. It was about the team, the people who had helped him get to where they were. As everyone gathered around the table, Daniel stood at the front, his hands clasped together. The faces of his employees were a mix of exhaustion and uncertainty. They had been through so much, and Daniel could see it in their eyes. They were questioning if the dream they had worked so hard for was worth the sacrifices. "Guys," Daniel began, his voice firm but full of emotion, "I want to start by saying thank you. Thank you for everything. You've all been incredible, and I know you've been working harder than ever. But I've also realized that I've been pushing us too hard, without paying attention to the cost. It's not just the work. It's the toll it's taken on all of you. And I'm sorry for that." He paused, looking around the room. "I've been so focused on growth, on what's next, that I didn't stop to ask what we need right now. We need balance. We need to take a step back and rebuild our foundation before we move forward. We need to take care of ourselves and each other." There was a long silence. Daniel could feel the weight of the room's collective sigh of relief. It was as if the air had shifted, and for the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. "We'll slow down. We'll bring in more help where we need it. We'll listen to each other, and we'll make sure that the heart of this business stays intact. It's not about the numbers. It's about the people." The next few weeks were a period of reflection and adjustment. Daniel and his team worked together to reassess their priorities, streamline operations, and create a work-life balance that had been missing for far too long. They hired more staff to take some of the workload off their shoulders and implemented new systems that allowed them to work smarter, not harder. Despite the slow pace of change, Daniel could already feel the difference. The energy in the store was lighter, the camaraderie stronger. His employees seemed happier, less stressed, and more connected to the mission of the business. It was a far cry from the frantic chaos that had defined the past several months, and it felt like the right move. But the question remained. Could they still meet Thomas Clarkson's expectations? Could they achieve the growth he envisioned while protecting the very culture that had made them successful? Daniel wasn't sure yet, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. They had reached their breaking point, but perhaps in facing it, they had found the key to long-term success. As the weeks passed, Daniel continued to feel a sense of renewal within the store. The changes they had implemented, a slower, more deliberate pace, additional hires, and better work-life balance, were beginning to show results. The team was happier, and the tension that had once dominated the workplace had begun to ease. Yet, despite the progress, Daniel couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were walking a tightrope. Thomas Clarkson, the investor, hadn't been pleased with the slower pace. He had made it clear in their last meeting that he wanted results, fast. Growth was key, and Daniel could sense that Clarkson was getting restless. The issue was, Daniel had to figure out how to meet Clarkson's aggressive expectations without sacrificing the very foundation of what had made the business so successful in the first place. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt torn between two worlds: the high-speed growth that Clarkson demanded and the well-being of his team that he was trying so hard to protect. One chilly Wednesday morning, Daniel got an unexpected call. It was from Thomas Clarkson. "Daniel," Clarkson's voice was all business. "I've been looking at the numbers, and I think it's time for us to start moving quicker. We've missed some opportunities while we've been waiting around for the right time. We can't afford to be cautious anymore." Daniel took a deep breath. This was the conversation he had been dreading. "I understand, Thomas," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "But the team is still adjusting. We need to ensure we have the right systems in place before we scale up. If we don't do this right, we could lose everything we've worked for." Clarkson didn't hesitate. "Listen, Daniel, I'm all for taking care of your people, but we can't keep waiting for the perfect moment. The market is shifting fast. If we don't capitalize on it, someone else will. We need to expand, and we need to do it now." Daniel felt a pang of frustration rising in his chest, but he knew there was no point in arguing. Clarkson had the power to pull his investment, and while Daniel was determined to build something sustainable, he also had to respect the fact that Clarkson was a vital part of the equation. "Okay," Daniel said, a decision forming in his mind. "But I need you to understand that if we do this, we're going to need more resources, more support. I'm not willing to burn out the team again just to meet some deadline." Clarkson paused. "We'll talk specifics next week, but I expect to see progress. Fast progress." As the call ended, Daniel sat back in his chair, staring at his desk. He felt the weight of the decision he was about to make. He knew that pushing for rapid growth meant risking the things he valued most: the culture, the team, the personal connections that had made the business feel like home. But he also knew that success didn't wait. In a world where businesses rose and fell overnight, stagnation was just as dangerous as burnout. That evening, Daniel called a meeting with Carla, Greg, and Emma. They had been with him through every twist and turn, and he trusted them with his vision. He needed their input now more than ever. As the team sat around the conference table, Daniel laid out the situation. He told them about the call with Clarkson and how he was pushing for quicker expansion. "I know we've all been working hard to keep things steady, but Clarkson wants us to move faster. He's expecting growth, and he's not willing to wait any longer," Daniel said, his voice laced with frustration. "But I need your honest feedback. I don't want to go down this road if it means burning out the team again." Carla leaned forward. "I get where Clarkson's coming from. We've all seen how fast the market is changing, and we know there are opportunities out there. But I'm with you, Daniel. We can't sacrifice the people who got us here just to chase after something that might not be sustainable." Greg nodded in agreement. "We've built something great, but the last few months have been tough on everyone. If we scale too quickly, we risk losing everything. The culture, the morale, the foundation. We need to find a balance. Emma, always the pragmatist, spoke up. What if we try to meet Clarkson's expectations, but in a way that doesn't compromise what we've built? Could we find a middle ground? Maybe slow and steady expansion with the right team and systems in place. Daniel felt a flicker of hope. That's exactly what I was thinking. We push forward, but we don't do it blindly. We keep the team's well-being at the forefront, but we also move strategically. Maybe we bring in more outside help to handle some of the logistics, so we don't stretch the current team too thin. The group fell silent for a moment, weighing the idea. Finally, Carla spoke again. I think it could work. We need to scale in a way that's manageable, ensuring that we have enough support and infrastructure to handle the growth. Daniel let out a deep breath, the tension in his chest loosening slightly. All right then, we'll move forward, but we'll do it our way, carefully, strategically. I'll call Clarkson tomorrow and let him know we're on board, but I need his support in making sure we have the resources we need to make this work. The next morning, Daniel dialed Clarkson's number, feeling the weight of the conversation ahead. When Clarkson answered, Daniel didn't waste any time. Thomas, I've thought about what you said, and I'm on board. We'll push forward, but we need more resources to make sure we do it right. We can't afford to jeopardize everything we've built. Clarkson was silent for a moment. All right, but I want results, and I want them fast. We'll get them, Daniel assured him, but we're going to do it in a way that ensures long-term success, not just quick wins. With the decision made, Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had a plan, one that allowed them to chase growth without losing sight of what mattered most. It wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges ahead, and Daniel knew there would be moments when the tension between speed and sustainability would feel overwhelming. But for now, he felt confident. He wasn't alone in this. He had a team that believed in the mission, that believed in him, and together, they would find the right way forward. The day after Daniel's conversation with Thomas Clarkson, the weight of his decision felt both daunting and exhilarating. He had committed to a path that balanced the ambition for growth with a renewed focus on the team's well-being. It was a compromise, but it was one he could live with. It wasn't just about achieving the numbers anymore. It was about doing so without losing sight of what had made the business so special in the first place. The first step was bringing in outside help. Daniel spent the following week meeting with potential consultants, operations experts, and advisors who could help streamline the expansion process. The goal wasn't to push the team harder, but to give them the tools and support they needed to grow without feeling overwhelmed. He also made a point of sitting down with each department head, Carla, Greg, and Emma, to discuss their concerns, goals, and vision for the future. It wasn't just about numbers and deadlines anymore. They had all agreed that any growth would need to be thoughtful, measured, and rooted in the core values of the business. Weeks turned into months, and the changes began to take shape. The consultants helped them implement new software to better track inventory and employee performance, which in turn allowed the team to operate more efficiently. They hired more staff to handle the increasing demands, ensuring that current employees didn't bear the brunt of the growing workload. At the same time, Daniel kept a close eye on morale. He was more hands-on than he had been in months, popping in and out of the store to check on his team, listening to their concerns, and celebrating their victories, no matter how small. Every success was a reminder that they were on the right path. But even as things started to stabilize, there was one final test: the expansion itself. The first new location opened a few weeks after Daniel's meeting with Clarkson. It was a modest store in a small but rapidly developing neighborhood. They had chosen it carefully, making sure that the location fit their brand and their values. This wasn't about opening a dozen stores in a matter of months. It was about being strategic, thoughtful, and intentional. The opening day was chaotic but exciting. The team was nervous, but there was also an undeniable sense of pride. Daniel stood in the doorway of the new store, watching as customers filtered in. His team was busy greeting people, helping them with their purchases, and making sure everything was running smoothly. At one point, Carla came up to him, a grin on her face. "I can't believe we're doing this," she said. "It feels real." Daniel smiled back. "Yeah, it feels like we're finally ready." The new location was a success, not just in terms of sales, but in how it was managed. There were no major hiccups, and the team handled everything with the care and attention they had given to their first store. It was a clear sign that they were on the right track. Over the next several months, Daniel and his team opened a few more stores, but each expansion was deliberate. Each location was chosen based on careful research, and each launch was supported by ample preparation. They learned from each experience, adjusted their approach, and continued to prioritize the well-being of their team. The key to their success wasn't just in the growth itself, it was in how they grew. Every step was measured, every decision deliberate, and every challenge met with collaboration and creativity. The company was no longer just a business. It was a community, one that valued its people and its mission. But the true test of their approach came a year later, when Daniel found himself back in the office with Thomas Clarkson. Clarkson had insisted on a meeting to review the company's progress. Despite the successful expansions, Daniel knew this meeting was going to be a big one. Clarkson had been critical in the past about the slow pace, and Daniel wasn't sure how he'd respond to the current strategy. "All right, Daniel," Clarkson began, his voice cool and measured. "Let's get to it. How are the numbers?" Daniel took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth. "The numbers are strong. We've expanded at a pace that's sustainable, and we've made sure that each new location is operating at peak efficiency. We've also made significant improvements to our internal systems, so our teams are well supported." Clarkson nodded slowly, but Daniel could tell he was waiting for more. "And how about the people? I know you've been focusing a lot on building the team, but that doesn't pay the bills. What's the bottom line?" Daniel didn't flinch. "The bottom line is that we've created a business model that values growth and people. We're seeing higher customer satisfaction rates, better employee retention, and more consistent profits. It's not just about pushing harder for more. It's about doing it the right way. And the right way is sustainable." Clarkson leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. He was silent for a moment, and for a second, Daniel wondered if he was about to hear a harsh critique. Finally, Clarkson spoke. "You know, Daniel, I have to admit, I was skeptical. I thought you were playing it too safe. But looking at these numbers and hearing what you've accomplished with your team, I have to say, I'm impressed." Daniel felt a rush of relief wash over him. "Thank you, Thomas. I think we've found a balance between growth and sustainability. It's not always easy, but it's working." Clarkson nodded, a slight smile creeping across his face. "Well, I'd say it's working just fine. Keep it up." As Daniel left the meeting, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had done it. The business was growing, but it hadn't come at the cost of the people who had helped him get there. The balance was fragile, but it was real. Later that evening, Daniel sat in his office, reflecting on the journey. It had been a long road, full of challenges, doubts, and tough decisions. But it had also been a road filled with growth, both personal and professional. He had learned that success wasn't just about reaching the top, it was about how you got there. And as he looked out the window at the bustling city below, he realized that, for the first time in a long time, he was at peace with the path ahead. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. Have you ever had to balance ambition and responsibility? What did you learn along the way? Share your thoughts below.